The plate slipped from Amara's hand and cracked against the kitchen tile before she even understood why her fingers had gone numb. Laughter was still rolling out of the living room, loud and careless, and one voice cut through all the others. It was Daniel's voice. He was telling his friends a story, and the story was about her. "You should have seen her face," Daniel said, his tone light, amused, the kind of tone a man uses when he is entertaining a room. "She actually thinks I read those letters she leaves under my pillow, every single one. Can you imagine? A grown woman writing love notes like a teenager." Someone laughed, then another. Amara stood frozen at the kitchen counter with a broken plate at her feet, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had written those letters 2 nights ago, after Daniel had come home late and tired, hoping a few kind words might soften the distance that had grown between them. She had folded each one carefully, the way she used to fold letters as a girl, believing that small gestures still meant something in a marriage. She had not expected to hear them mocked in her own home, in front of guests, while she was only a few steps away. She bent down and began picking up the broken pieces of the plate, her hands shaking, telling herself it was only a joke, that Daniel did not mean it the way it sounded, that men sometimes said careless things when they wanted to impress their friends. She had told herself this so many times over the past few years that the words had worn smooth, like stones rubbed down by a river, no longer sharp enough to hurt when she repeated them. But tonight the stone had an edge again. She carried the broken pieces to the trash bin and stood there a moment, staring at nothing, listening to her own heartbeat slow down. Then she smoothed her dress, straightened her shoulders, and walked back into the living room with a tray of tea, smiling the way a good hostess is supposed to smile. No one in that room could have guessed that the woman pouring their tea had just heard her private tenderness turned into a punchline. Amara had not always felt so small in her own house. When she first met Daniel 8 years earlier, he had a way of looking at her that made her feel like the only person in a crowded room. He would show up outside her college gates with flowers he clearly did not know how to hold properly, and he would talk about his dreams with such energy that she found herself believing every word. He wanted to build something of his own, he told her. A business, a name, a life that people would respect. She had believed in him before the world did, and for a long time, that belief had felt like the most important thing she had ever given anyone. They married 2 years after they met, in a small ceremony that neither of their families could afford to make grand, but which felt, at the time, like the beginning of something honest and good. Amara remembered standing beside him, feeling his hand tighten around hers, and thinking that whatever life brought them, they would face it together. For a while, that promise held. In the early years, Daniel worked long hours at a small trading company, coming home exhausted but grateful, and Amara built their home out of very little, stretching every rupee, learning to cook dishes that filled the house with warmth even when the refrigerator was nearly empty. She never complained. She told herself that struggle shared was easier to carry, and she took quiet pride in being the kind of wife who did not ask for more than what they had. Then slowly, the trading company grew. Daniel's hard work began to pay off, and with success came new circles, new friends, new rooms that Amara had never been invited into before. Business dinners, golf weekends, evenings with men who wore expensive watches and spoke about vacations to places Amara had only seen in magazines. At first, she was proud of him. She ironed his shirts with extra care before these dinners, made sure his shoes were polished, reminded him gently not to forget his father's old watch, the one he liked to wear for luck. She wanted him to shine in these new rooms because his success still felt like their success, built from the same struggle they had shared together. But something in Daniel began to shift as those rooms grew more familiar to him. He started noticing things about Amara that he had never seemed to notice before. The way she pronounced certain English words, softened by the accent of the village she grew up in. The plainness of her clothes, chosen for comfort rather than fashion. The fact that she preferred staying home with a book to attending parties full of strangers. He did not say anything cruel about these things at first. It came in smaller ways, comments dressed up as jokes. "You should dress a little more like Paula," he said one evening, referring to the wife of one of his new business partners, a woman who always seemed to arrive at events in something new and glamorous. She always looks like she belongs in those rooms. Amara had laughed it off then, told him she would think about it, and even bought a new dress the following week, hoping it would please him. He barely noticed. Another time, at a dinner with his colleagues, someone asked Amara what she did for work. She explained with quiet pride that she managed the home and had recently begun tutoring neighborhood children in the evenings, something she found deeply fulfilling. Before she could finish, Daniel cut in, smiling at the table. "She keeps herself busy," he said, waving a hand as though brushing away the importance of what she had just shared. "Not everyone needs a big career. Some people are happy with small things." The table had laughed politely, moved on to another topic, and Amara had sat there with her fork frozen halfway to her mouth, feeling the sentence settle over her like a fine layer of dust that would not wash off no matter how many times she scrubbed at it later that night in her thoughts. These moments were small. Individually, they seemed forgivable, the kind of thing a tired man might say without thinking, the kind of thing a devoted wife learns to overlook because overlooking feels easier than confronting. Amara excused each one as it came, filing it away in some quiet corner of her mind, telling herself that Daniel still loved her underneath all this, that the man who used to show up outside her college gates with badly held flowers was still somewhere inside the man now correcting her posture before dinner parties and reminding her not to talk too much about small things. She held onto that belief the way a person holds onto a rope while climbing, gripping tighter even as her palms began to burn. What she did not fully understand yet, what she would only understand months later on a sleepless night with the house silent around her, was that a person's contempt rarely appears all at once. It arrives in pieces, disguised as jokes, as feedback, as harmless comparisons, until one day the person on the receiving end looks up and realizes the floor beneath her has quietly been replaced with something entirely different from what she thought she was standing on. That night after the guests had gone and the last cup had been washed and dried, Amara lay in bed beside Daniel, who had already drifted into an easy, satisfied sleep, his breathing slow and even, untroubled by anything he had said. She stared at the ceiling fan turning above her, listening to its quiet hum, and thought about the letters he had mocked. She had written them because she missed the way things used to be. She had written them hoping that a small reminder of tenderness might bring some of that old warmth back into a home that had grown colder without either of them fully admitting it. Instead, her tenderness had become material for a joke, shared with strangers over wine, while she stood 2 rooms away holding a tray of tea and a smile she did not feel. She told herself, as she had told herself so many times before, that tomorrow would be different, that this was simply a bad night in an otherwise good marriage, that Daniel loved her in his own way even if he had forgotten how to show it gently. She turned onto her side, away from him, and closed her eyes, willing herself towards sleep. But sleep did not come easily. Somewhere beneath her exhaustion, a small, steady thought had begun to form, one she was not yet ready to look at directly. It sat quietly in the back of her mind, patient, waiting for the night when she would finally be forced to face it. The next morning, Daniel woke up humming, cheerful, as though the previous evening had left no mark on him at all. He kissed Amara's forehead on his way to the shower, told her breakfast smelled wonderful, and asked, almost as an afterthought, if she had enjoyed the party. Amara looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign that he remembered what he had said, any flicker of guilt or awareness. There was none. To him, the evening had been a success, a pleasant night with friends, nothing more. He genuinely did not understand that he had done anything wrong. That, Amara realized as she handed him his cup of tea, was somehow worse than if he had known and simply not cared. It meant that mocking her had become so natural to him that it no longer registered as unkindness. It had simply become the way he spoke about her, a habit worn into the shape of their marriage, the way a path is worn into grass by the same footsteps taken again and again. She smiled at him anyway, told him breakfast was ready, and watched him leave for work with his usual energy, his usual confidence, completely unaware that somewhere inside his wife, a quiet crack had begun to spread, thin as a hairline at first, but growing wider with every small cruelty that would follow in the weeks ahead. Outside, the morning was bright and ordinary, birds calling from the trees along their street, neighbors beginning their day as though nothing unusual had happened in the house at the end of the road. But inside, Amara stood at the window with her cup of tea slowly going cold in her hands, staring at nothing in particular, feeling for the first time a small, sharp awareness that something in her life had shifted, and that she would not be able to unsee it now that she had seen it clearly. She did not yet know how far this crack would spread. She did not yet know that the letters she had written in love would become, in her memory, the first clear proof of something she would spend the coming weeks trying desperately not to believe. All she knew, standing there in the quiet kitchen with the morning light falling across the floor, was that something had changed the night before, and that no amount of smiling through it would make that change disappear. 3 weeks passed, and the small crack Amara had noticed did not close on its own. Instead, it widened in ways so gradual that she almost convinced herself she was imagining things. Almost. It began with Victor, one of Daniel's new business partners, a tall man with an easy laugh who had started coming around the house more often than Amara felt comfortable with. Victor had a habit of speaking about his own wife, Clara, with a kind of casual admiration that made Amara feel, without anyone saying a word against her, that she was somehow falling short of a standard she had never agreed to be measured against. "Clara just came back from Paris," Victor said one evening, settling into the armchair in their living room as though it belonged to him. "She's redoing the whole house. Modern style. You should see the photos, Daniel. Honestly, it looks like something from a magazine." Daniel nodded along, clearly impressed, glancing briefly at their own modest living room with its mismatched furniture, most of it bought second-hand during their early years together, each piece chosen with care rather than money. Amara had always loved this room. It held memories she could point to, a chair Daniel had fixed himself with his own hands the year they married, a rug she had bargained for in the market with her mother beside her, laughing at how stubborn she could be over a few hundred rupees. To her, the room was not mismatched. It was a record of their life. But watching Daniel's face that evening, comparing his own home silently to Victor's descriptions of Clara's redesigned rooms, Amara understood that he was no longer seeing the room the way she saw it. He was seeing it the way Victor might see it, and finding it lacking. After Victor left that night, Daniel walked through the living room slowly, running his hand along the back of the old armchair, frowning slightly. "Maybe we should think about redoing this place," he said, not quite looking at her. "It's starting to feel a bit outdated." "I like it the way it is," Amara said carefully. "Every piece here means something to us." Daniel gave a short laugh, the kind that had no real humor in it. "Sentiment doesn't impress anyone, Amara. People notice how you live. They judge you by it whether you like it or not." She did not answer. She simply nodded, the way she had learned to nod in recent months, agreeing outwardly while something inside her quietly refused to agree at all. It was not long after this that the comments about her began to grow sharper, less like careless jokes and more like deliberate corrections, as though Daniel had appointed himself the editor of everything about her that did not fit into the life he now imagined for himself. At a dinner hosted by one of his colleagues, Amara wore a sari her mother had given her on her wedding day, a soft blue fabric with delicate embroidery along the edges, chosen because it made her feel close to her mother, who had passed away 2 years earlier. She had been looking forward to wearing it, had ironed it carefully that afternoon, humming to herself as she worked. When she came out of the bedroom ready to leave, Daniel looked her over with an expression she had not seen from him before, a flicker of something close to embarrassment. "You're wearing that?" he asked. "It was my mother's gift," Amara said quietly. "I thought tonight would be a nice time to wear it." "It looks a bit old-fashioned for this crowd," Daniel said, already turning away to check his phone. "Everyone there dresses more modern. just where the green one instead, the one Paula complimented last time. Amara stood there a moment, feeling something tighten in her chest. A small, sharp ache that had nothing to do with the fabric of the sari and everything to do with what it represented. She wanted to explain that this was not simply cloth to her, that it carried her mother's hands in its stitching, her mother's voice telling her how beautiful she looked on her wedding day. But she could see, from the way Daniel was already reaching for his car keys, that he had no patience left for that conversation. She changed into the green dress instead, folding the blue sari carefully back into its box, her fingers lingering on the embroidery for a moment before she closed the lid. That evening at the dinner, Amara sat quietly while conversation flowed around her, contributing when she could, smiling when it seemed expected, but feeling increasingly like a guest in her own life rather than a participant in it. She noticed how easily Daniel laughed with Paula and Victor, how naturally he leaned into conversations about investments and property and vacations she knew they could not yet afford, how his voice took on a confident, polished tone that seemed to belong to a version of himself she barely recognized. At one point, Paula turned to Amara and asked, kindly enough, what she had been doing with herself lately. "I've been tutoring some children in our neighborhood," Amara said, her voice warming with genuine pride. "There's a girl named Ruth who started with me barely able to read simple sentences, and last week she read an entire short story out loud on her own. It was one of the best moments I've had in a long time." "That's lovely," Paula said, smiling politely, though her eyes had already begun to drift toward another conversation happening across the table. Daniel, overhearing, leaned in with a small laugh. "She's very dedicated to her little projects," he said, patting Amara's hand in a way that felt more dismissive than affectionate. "Someone has to keep busy while the rest of us are out there building something bigger." The table laughed lightly, moved on, and once again Amara felt the same dust settle over her, the same quiet erasure of something that had mattered deeply to her, reduced in a single sentence to a little project, unworthy of real conversation among people who talked about bigger things. She said nothing that night. She smiled, she nodded, she helped clear the table when the hosts needed an extra hand, and she rode home in the passenger seat while Daniel talked animatedly about a new investment opportunity Victor had mentioned, his voice full of the same energy he used to bring home from his early struggling days, except now it was aimed entirely outward, toward people and possibilities that had nothing to do with her. It was around this time that Amara began noticing something else, something that troubled her more than the comments themselves. Daniel had started speaking about her, in front of others, with a kind of performance that seemed designed less to describe her accurately and more to entertain whoever was listening at her expense. It was not always cruel on the surface. Sometimes it was framed as affection, a husband teasing his wife the way husbands are expected to. But underneath the teasing, Amara could feel something colder, something that treated her not as a partner, but as a character in a story Daniel was telling about himself. A character whose simplicity made his own sophistication shine brighter by comparison. One afternoon, her sister Nora came to visit, carrying a bag of mangoes from their childhood home and a bright, familiar laugh that Amara had missed without realizing how much. They sat together in the kitchen, peeling fruit and talking the way sisters talk when years of shared history sit comfortably between them. "You seem tired," Nora said eventually, watching Amara closely. "Is everything all right with Daniel?" Amara hesitated. She had not spoken to anyone about the shift she had been feeling, partly because she was not sure how to describe it, and partly because saying it out loud felt like admitting something she was not ready to face. "He's just busy with work," Amara said finally. "Success changes people a little, I think. He'll settle back down." Nora studied her sister's face for a long moment, the way only someone who has known you since childhood can study you, seeing past the careful arrangement of your expression into the tiredness underneath. "Amara," she said gently, "you used to light up a room just by walking into it. Lately, when I see you, it's like you're trying to take up less space. I've noticed it for months now. I just didn't know how to say it." Amara felt her throat tighten unexpectedly, tears rising before she could stop them. She busied her hands with the mangoes, focusing on the simple motion of peeling, trying to steady herself. "I don't know what's happening," she admitted quietly, the words slipping out before she could soften them. "I feel like I'm slowly disappearing in my own house, and I don't understand how it happened so fast." Nora reached across the table and took her sister's hand, saying nothing for a long moment, simply holding it, offering the kind of comfort that does not require words. It was the first time in weeks that Amara had felt truly seen, and the relief of it was almost overwhelming. "You haven't disappeared," Nora said finally. "You've just been quiet about something that deserves to be spoken out loud. There's a difference, and I think it's time you remembered that." Amara did not respond right away. She sat with her sister's words, letting them settle into the same quiet corner of her mind where she had been storing every small cruelty, every dismissive comment, every moment of feeling smaller in rooms where she used to feel whole. For the first time, instead of filing the feeling away and moving forward with a smile, she allowed herself to simply sit with it, to acknowledge that something was genuinely wrong, and that pretending otherwise was costing her more than she had been willing to admit. That evening, after Nora left, Amara stood at the kitchen window watching the sun sink behind the houses across the street, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. She thought about the woman she had been 8 years ago, standing outside her college gates, laughing at a young man holding badly arranged flowers, believing wholeheartedly in the life they were about to build together. She wondered when exactly that woman had started shrinking, and whether there was still time to find her way back to who she used to be, or whether the version of herself she was becoming now, quiet and careful and constantly bracing for the next small wound, was simply who she was meant to be from now on. She did not have an answer yet, but for the first time, she let herself ask the question honestly, without immediately reaching for an excuse to soften it. And somewhere in that honest asking, though she did not fully realize it yet, the first true seed of her eventual courage had been planted. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, printed on thick cream paper with gold lettering, announcing a celebration at Victor and Clara's newly redesigned house. Daniel had been talking about this party for days, mentioning it at breakfast, at dinner, even once while brushing his teeth, listing the important people who would be there, the deals that might quietly take shape over drinks, the impression he wanted to make. "This is a big night," he told Amara as she helped him choose a tie 2 evenings before the event. "Victor's bringing in some serious investors. If things go well, this could change everything for us." Amara nodded, genuinely hopeful for him despite everything that had settled uneasily between them in recent weeks. Whatever distance had grown in their marriage, she still wanted good things for Daniel. She still remembered the exhausted, hopeful young man who used to come home smelling of dust and diesel from long days at the trading company, collapsing onto their small second-hand sofa, and talking about the future as though it were a bright country just over the horizon, waiting for them to arrive together. She chose her outfit carefully for the party, not the blue sari this time, understanding without needing to be told again that it would not fit the evening Daniel had in mind, but a deep green dress she had bought years ago for a cousin's wedding, one of the few pieces in her closet that still made her feel elegant when she looked in the mirror. She styled her hair the way she used to before the demands of daily life left her little time for such things, and when she finally stood ready by the door, she felt, for the first time in weeks, something close to her old confidence returning. Daniel glanced at her briefly as they left the house, said she looked nice, and then spent most of the car ride reviewing names and details about the guests they were about to meet, his mind clearly already at the party even though his body was still beside her in the car. Victor and Clara's house, when they arrived, was exactly as grand as Victor had described over the past weeks, though seeing it in person still struck Amara with a kind of quiet awe. Marble floors reflected the warm light of elaborate chandeliers. A small orchestra played softly near the garden, where fairy lights had been strung between the trees, turning the evening air golden. Waiters moved gracefully through the crowd with trays of drinks and small, elegant plates of food, that Amara could not identify but assumed were expensive. She stayed close to Daniel at first, greeting people as he introduced her, offering polite conversation, laughing at jokes that were not particularly funny simply because laughing seemed to be what the room expected of her. She noticed, as the evening went on, how Daniel's confidence grew with every drink, every handshake, every compliment from Victor's wealthy friends about his sharp business instincts and his promising future. It was near the end of the dinner, when the guests had gathered in a large circle near the garden, drinks in hand, that the conversation turned, as it often did among Daniel's new friends, toward marriage and love, spoken about with the kind of casual cynicism that people sometimes mistake for sophistication. "My theory," Victor was saying, gesturing with his glass, "is that love is mostly practical after a certain point. You marry someone who fits your life, who makes sense with where you're going. The rest is just romance novels." A ripple of laughter and agreement moved through the circle. Amara stood quietly near Daniel's side, holding a glass of juice she had barely touched, listening without offering an opinion, though privately she disagreed with every word Victor had said. To her, love had never been about fitting neatly into a plan. It had been about choosing someone, again and again, even when life did not make things easy or convenient. Then Paula, laughing, turned toward Daniel with a teasing smile. "Speaking of romance novels, Daniel, is it true your wife writes you love letters? Victor mentioned something about it the other night." Amara felt her stomach drop instantly, the memory of the broken plate on the kitchen floor rising sharp and sudden in her mind. She glanced at Daniel, silently hoping, praying almost, that this time he would simply smile, perhaps say something kind, or at the very least say nothing at all. Instead, Daniel laughed, loud and easy, clearly enjoying the attention of the circle now turned toward him. "Oh, it's true," he said, shaking his head as though sharing an amusing secret. "She still leaves little notes around the house like we're in some old-fashioned film. Under my pillow, in my briefcase, once even in my shoe, if you can believe that. I keep telling her we're not teenagers anymore, but she just won't stop." The group laughed, warm and easy, the kind of laughter that comes from people who see nothing wrong with what has just been said. Amara stood frozen, her face growing hot, aware suddenly of how many eyes had turned toward her, some amused, some faintly pitying, as though she were a charming but slightly embarrassing pet rather than a wife standing beside her husband. "That's actually kind of sweet," one woman offered kindly, perhaps sensing Amara's discomfort. "Sweet, sure," Daniel said, still smiling, clearly not finished. "But you should see her face when I forget to read one. She gets so serious about it, like I've committed some terrible crime. Honestly, sometimes I think she loves the idea of us more than she loves anything real about who I actually am now. She's still stuck somewhere back when we had nothing." The words landed differently this time than they had at the earlier gathering. This time, Amara was not 2 rooms away, safely hidden by walls and distance. She was standing directly beside him, close enough to see the amusement in his eyes, close enough to feel every syllable of the sentence settle over her like something physical, pressing against her chest until breathing itself became an effort. She thought of the letters she had written, each one chosen with care, each sentence meant to remind him of the man she had fallen in love with, meant to build a small bridge back toward the closeness they used to share. She had never imagined those letters becoming material for laughter among strangers, evidence presented to a circle of well-dressed people as proof that she was somehow behind the times, unable to keep up with the polished, modern life Daniel now believed he deserved. She wanted, more than anything in that moment, to simply walk away, to find a quiet corner of the garden where she could breathe without an audience watching her face for a reaction. But leaving now, in the middle of the circle, would only draw more attention, would only give Daniel another story to tell later about how sensitive she had been, how she couldn't take a joke. So she stayed. She forced her lips into the shape of a smile, though it did not reach her eyes, and she said nothing, letting the conversation move past her the way water moves past a stone too heavy to be carried along with the current. It was Clara, of all people, who noticed. She approached Amara a short while later, near the edge of the garden where the music was quieter, and handed her a fresh glass of juice without being asked. "Ignore them," Clara said quietly, her voice free of the polished performance she had worn all evening in front of her other guests. "Men like that talk big when they've had a few drinks and an audience. It doesn't mean anything." "It's all right," Amara said automatically, the same defense she had offered herself 100 times in recent weeks. "He didn't mean it badly." Clara studied her for a moment, something knowing in her expression. "I used to say that too," she said, "about someone else a long time ago. It's a comfortable thing to believe. I just want you to know, whenever you're ready to stop believing it, you'll be surprised how much lighter you feel." She walked away before Amara could respond, leaving her standing alone near the string lights, turning Clara's words over in her mind, feeling something in them settle deep and uncomfortable, close to a truth she had been avoiding for far too long. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of small talk and forced smiles. Amara found herself watching Daniel from a slight distance, observing him the way a stranger might, noticing how easily charm came to him now, how completely he had transformed into someone comfortable holding a room's attention, someone who no longer seemed to remember, or perhaps no longer cared, that the woman standing quietly at the edge of every circle he commanded was the same person who had once believed in him when believing cost something real. On the drive home, Daniel was in high spirits, talking eagerly about the connections he had made, the possibilities the evening had opened up, completely unaware, or perhaps simply unconcerned, that Amara had said almost nothing since they left the party. "You were quiet tonight," he finally noticed, glancing at her briefly before returning his eyes to the road. "Everything all right?" Amara looked out the window at the streetlights sliding past, gathering the courage to say something she had swallowed too many times before. "Why did you tell everyone about my letters?" she asked quietly. Daniel gave a short laugh, clearly surprised by the question. "It was just a joke, Amara. Why are you making it a big deal?" "It didn't feel like a joke to me," she said, her voice steady despite the tightness in her throat. "It felt like you were laughing at something I did because I love you, in front of people I barely know." "You're being too sensitive," Daniel said, his tone shifting slightly, an edge of impatience creeping into it now. "It's just how people talk at parties. Nobody actually cares about your little letters, Amara. I don't know why you're acting like I committed some crime." The word little, once again applied so casually to something she had poured her heart into, struck her harder than she expected. She turned to look at him, searching his profile in the dim light of passing street lamps, trying to find some trace of the man who used to read every note she left him twice, who used to keep the very first letter she had ever written him folded carefully in his wallet for years. She did not find him, or perhaps he was still there, somewhere beneath the confident, polished stranger now sitting beside her, but buried too deep beneath ambition and new friendships and careless habits to reach any more. "Forget it," Amara said quietly, turning back to the window. They drove the rest of the way home in silence, though it was not the comfortable silence of two people who understood each other without needing words. It was the heavy, uneven silence of two people who had, without either fully admitting it aloud, begun standing on opposite sides of something neither of them yet had a name for. When they arrived home, Daniel went straight to bed, still slightly buoyed by the success of his evening, already thinking, Amara suspected, about the investors he hoped to impress and the future he imagined for himself. Amara stayed downstairs a while longer, sitting alone in the living room among the mismatched furniture that still held their early memories, staring at nothing in particular, replaying the evening again and again in her mind. She thought about the letters, about the folded blue sari still sitting untouched in its box, about Clara's quiet words near the garden lights, about her sister Nora's gentle observation weeks earlier that she had begun taking up less space in her own life. Each memory settled beside the others, forming a shape she was no longer able to ignore, no matter how many times she had tried to convince herself otherwise. For the first time, sitting alone in the quiet house long after midnight, Amara allowed herself to admit something she had been avoiding for months. This was not a passing rough patch that time would smooth over on its own. Something fundamental had shifted between them, and pretending otherwise, smiling through it, folding herself smaller to keep the peace, was no longer protecting the marriage she had once believed in. It was simply allowing it to continue eroding, one careless joke at a time, until there might be nothing left of her original self to save. She did not yet know what she would do with this realization, but she understood, with a clarity that frightened her slightly, that the woman who had smiled through the evening's humiliation would not be able to keep smiling forever. Something inside her had shifted tonight, quietly but unmistakably, and there would be no easy way to shift it back. Amara did not raise the subject again for 3 days. She moved through the house the way she always did, preparing meals, managing small errands, tutoring Ruth and the other neighborhood children in the evenings, keeping the rhythm of daily life steady on the surface while something churned beneath it, waiting for the right moment to rise. The moment arrived on a quiet Thursday night, after Daniel had come home later than usual, smelling faintly of the celebratory drinks he had shared with Victor over a new deal that had apparently gone well. He was in good spirits, humming as he loosened his tie, and for a moment, watching him from the kitchen doorway, Amara almost let the evening pass without saying anything at all. But then she thought of the letters, of the garden lights, of Clara's quiet words, and she understood that if she let this moment pass too, she would keep letting moments pass indefinitely, each one a small surrender, until there was nothing left of her voice to reclaim. "Daniel," she said, her tone calm but firm enough that he paused what he was doing and looked at her properly. "I want to talk about something." "Can it wait?" he asked, already moving toward the stairs. "I'm exhausted and honestly it's been a good day, let's not ruin it." "It's been 3 days since the party," Amara said, staying where she stood, refusing to let him simply walk past the conversation the way he had walked past so many others. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about what happened there. I need you to actually hear me this time." Something in her voice must have caught his attention, because he stopped on the second stair and turned to face her fully, his expression shifting from casual dismissal to a wary kind of attention. "Fine," he said, coming back down and crossing his arms. "What is it?" Amara took a breath, steadying herself. She had rehearsed this conversation in her mind more times than she could count over the past 3 days, but standing here now, facing him directly, all her careful words seemed to scatter, leaving only the plain truth behind. "You mocked me in front of your friends," she said. "Not once but twice now in front of people I barely know. You made my letters, something I wrote because I love you, into a joke for everyone to laugh at. And when I told you it hurt me, you said I was being too sensitive. I need you to understand how much that hurt." Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, and Amara could see him deciding, almost visibly, how to respond. For a brief moment, she hoped he might surprise her, might finally see clearly what he had done, and offer the apology she had been waiting for. Instead, he sighed, the sound heavy with impatience rather than remorse. "Amara, it was a joke," he said. "I don't understand why you keep bringing this up like it's some huge betrayal. Everyone jokes about their partners at parties. It's normal. You're the only one who seems to think it's a big deal." "It wasn't just a joke to me," Amara said, her voice trembling slightly now despite her effort to stay steady. "You told a room full of strangers that I love the idea of us more than I love who you actually are. Do you understand what that felt like, standing right beside you while you said it?" "I was exaggerating for effect," Daniel said, waving a hand as though brushing the accusation aside like a fly. "You know how these conversations go. People say things to be funny to keep the mood light. You're taking it far too literally." "I'm not taking it literally," Amara said. "I'm taking it seriously because it revealed something true, whether you meant it to or not. You're embarrassed by me now, Daniel. You have been for weeks. The clothes, the letters, even the way I talk about the children I tutor, all of it embarrasses you in front of your new friends, and instead of being honest with me about that, you turn it into jokes and let other people laugh at my expense." For a moment, something flickered across Daniel's face, something that might have been the beginning of recognition, of genuine reflection. Amara held her breath, hoping. But then his expression hardened again, defensiveness rising to cover whatever brief honesty had almost surfaced. Maybe if you tried a little harder to fit in with the people in my life now, I wouldn't have anything to joke about, he said, his voice sharper now, edged with a frustration that had clearly been building for longer than Amara had realized. I'm working hard to build something for our future, and instead of supporting that, you're standing here criticizing how I talk at parties. Do you know how exhausting it is, constantly worrying about whether you'll say the wrong thing, wear the wrong outfit, embarrass me in front of people whose opinions actually matter for our future? The words hit Amara with a force that momentarily stole her breath. There it was, finally, spoken plainly instead of disguised as humor. Daniel was embarrassed by her. He saw her not as a partner walking beside him through this new chapter of their life, but as a liability to be managed, a rough edge to be smoothed over or hidden away depending on the company they kept. So that's it, Amara said quietly, her voice steadier now than she expected, something in her settling into a strange, sharp clarity even as her heart ached. You're not sorry for humiliating me. You're frustrated that I noticed. That's not what I said, Daniel replied, though his tone lacked real conviction, as though even he could hear the truth underneath his own words. It's exactly what you said, Amara replied. You just didn't expect me to understand it so clearly. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated, clearly wanting this conversation to end. Look, he said, his voice softening slightly, though Amara could hear it was softening out of a desire to close the subject rather than genuine remorse. I love you, all right. I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm just under a lot of pressure right now, trying to build something better for both of us. Can we please just move past this? Amara studied him for a long moment, searching his face the way she had searched it in the car after the party, looking for some sign of the man she had married. She found only tiredness now, tiredness and impatience, a man eager to return to the version of the evening he had enjoyed before this conversation interrupted it. I don't think we can just move past this, she said finally. Not the way you mean, not by pretending it didn't happen. So what do you want me to do? Daniel asked, exasperation creeping back into his voice. Apologize dramatically, promise never to joke around again. I'm not going to walk on eggshells in my own house, Amara. I work hard. I'm allowed to relax and have fun with my friends without you turning every little thing into a crisis. I'm not asking you to walk on eggshells, Amara said quietly. I'm asking you to see me, to respect what I give you, even if it doesn't fit into the kind of life you're trying to build now. I'm asking you to protect my heart the way I've spent years protecting yours. For a moment, silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable, filled with everything neither of them seemed able to say clearly enough to bridge the growing distance between who they used to be and who they had somehow become. Then Daniel sighed again, the sound final this time, closing rather than opening. I'm too tired for this tonight, he said. Can we talk about it tomorrow? I have an early meeting. He turned and climbed the stairs without waiting for her answer, leaving Amara standing alone in the living room, surrounded by furniture that held 8 years of memories, listening to his footsteps fade toward their bedroom, toward sleep that would come easily to him despite everything that had just been said. Amara did not follow him immediately. She stood there for a long while, replaying the conversation, searching it for anything she might have said differently, any door she might have left open that Daniel had simply chosen not to walk through. She found none. She had spoken as clearly and honestly as she knew how, and he had responded not with understanding, but with a defense that revealed, more plainly than any joke ever could, exactly how he had come to see her. She thought of Clara's words at the party, quiet and knowing, spoken by a woman who seemed to recognize something in Amara's silence that Amara herself had not yet been ready to name. She thought of Nora's gentle observation weeks earlier, about taking up less space, about disappearing quietly inside her own life. She thought of the letters, folded carefully, meant as gifts, turned instead into evidence for a joke. Standing alone in the quiet living room, long after Daniel's footsteps had faded upstairs, Amara felt something inside her shift permanently, a door quietly closing that she understood, with a strange and heavy certainty she would not be opening again. She did not cry. She had expected if this conversation went badly that she might. But instead, she felt something closer to clarity, cold and clean, settling over the ache in her chest. She understood now, with a certainty she had been avoiding for weeks, that no amount of patience, no amount of quiet endurance was going to bring back the man who once folded her first letter into his wallet and carried it with him for years. That man, if he still existed at all, was buried too deep beneath the version of Daniel that had emerged from success. A version who measured worth by polish and performance, who had learned to see his own wife through the eyes of strangers at a party, rather than through the eyes of the young man who once believed she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Amara turned off the living room lights and climbed the stairs slowly, each step deliberate, carrying with her a decision she had not yet fully formed into words, but which had, somewhere in the space between his defensive words and her own quiet clarity, already begun to take shape. She did not know yet exactly what she would do, but she knew, with a certainty that settled deep into her bones, that whatever came next would not involve pretending any longer, that everything between them was simply fine. Sleep did not come to Amara that night. She lay beside Daniel, listening to his breathing settle into its usual steady rhythm within minutes, undisturbed, unburdened, while her own mind refused to quiet down no matter how many times she closed her eyes and tried to still her thoughts. The ceiling fan turned slowly above her, its familiar hum usually a comfort, tonight simply a backdrop to the memories rising one after another in her mind, each one arriving with a clarity she had not allowed herself before. She thought of the early days of their marriage, when Daniel would come home from the trading company covered in the dust of a long day, dropping onto their second-hand sofa and pulling her down beside him, saying nothing at first, simply holding her hand as though her presence alone was enough to make the exhaustion worth it. She thought of the year their savings had nearly run out, when a shipment Daniel had invested in was delayed for months, and they had eaten simple meals of rice and lentils for weeks, stretching every rupee, and yet somehow those had been some of the closest months of their marriage. Daniel used to tell her, in the dark of their small bedroom back then, that whatever happened to the business, he was grateful every single day that she was the one beside him through it. She had believed him completely. She thought of the first letter she had ever written him, slipped into his coat pocket before an important meeting he had been nervous about, simple words telling him she believed in him no matter what happened that day. He had come home that evening, pulled the letter from his pocket, and read it aloud to her with tears in his eyes, telling her it was the reason he had walked into that meeting with enough courage to close the deal that changed the direction of their finances for the better. He had kept that letter in his wallet for years afterward, showing it to her occasionally, worn soft at the folds from being carried everywhere he went. She wondered, lying there in the dark now, exactly when he had stopped carrying it. She wondered if he even still had it somewhere, tucked into a drawer, forgotten beneath receipts and old business cards, or whether it had been thrown away at some point during the slow, quiet process of becoming a man who now found her letters embarrassing rather than precious. Around midnight, unable to lie still any longer, Amara rose quietly and made her way downstairs, careful not to wake Daniel, though she suspected, given how deeply he slept these days, that little short of an earthquake would have disturbed him. She sat at the kitchen table where she had shared thousands of meals with him over the years, and in the dim light of the small lamp above the stove, she allowed herself, finally, to think clearly about everything that had happened. She began, almost involuntarily, to count, not with bitterness, though bitterness hovered at the edges, but with the same careful attention she gave to balancing their household accounts each month, adding up small numbers until they revealed a total larger than she had expected. She counted the comments about her clothes, dismissed at the time as harmless preferences, now understood as the early edges of something deeper. She counted the times he had spoken over her at dinners, redirecting conversations away from the things she cared about toward subjects that made him look impressive to whoever was listening. She counted the evenings he had come home late without calling, assuming, correctly, that she would simply wait, would simply understand, would simply continue being patient because patience was what she had always offered him without complaint. She counted the 2 occasions. Now, when her private tenderness had been turned into public entertainment, laughed at by people who did not know her, who did not know what those letters had cost her in courage to write, who saw only a punchline where she had poured genuine feeling. She counted, too, the moments when she had excused each of these things, telling herself he was tired, he was stressed. He did not mean it the way it sounded. He still loved her underneath it all. She realized, sitting there in the quiet kitchen, that she had spent months, perhaps longer, constructing explanations for behavior that required no explanation at all, because the truth, once acknowledged, was simply too painful to hold. The truth was this. Somewhere along the way, without either of them fully noticing the moment it happened, Daniel had stopped seeing her as an equal partner in the life they were building together, and had started seeing her instead as something to be managed, corrected, occasionally displayed and occasionally hidden, depending on which version of himself he was trying to present to the world that day. Amara pressed her palms against her eyes, feeling tears finally rise now that she was alone, now that there was no audience requiring a composed expression, no husband requiring reassurance that everything was fine. She let herself cry quietly at the kitchen table, mourning not just the humiliation of the past weeks, but the slow loss of a marriage she had believed, until very recently, was simply going through a difficult but temporary season. It was not temporary. She understood that now with a clarity that felt almost physical, settling into her chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward that reached every corner of how she now understood her life. She thought of her children then, though she and Daniel had not yet been blessed with children of their own. She thought instead of Ruth and the other neighborhood children she tutored each evening, thought of the pride she felt watching them grow more confident with each lesson, thought of the version of herself that existed in those hours, patient, valued, genuinely respected for what she offered. That version of herself felt increasingly distant from the woman who sat quietly through dinners, while her husband redirected conversations away from her, who folded expensive dresses back into boxes because they did not fit the image he wanted to present, who smiled through humiliation because confrontation felt more frightening than endurance. She thought, too, of her mother, gone 2 years now, who had raised Amara and Nora largely alone after their father passed when they were still young, who had worked long hours as a seamstress to keep her daughters fed and educated, who had told Amara once, not long before she passed, something Amara had not fully understood until this very moment sitting alone in her kitchen. Love is not the same as disappearing for someone, her mother had said, sewing quietly by lamplight while Amara sat nearby doing her homework. A good marriage makes you more of who you are, not less. If you ever find yourself becoming smaller to keep someone comfortable, that is not love asking that of you. That is something else wearing love's face. Amara had nodded at the time, young and in love with the idea of love itself, not yet understanding how easily those words might one day apply directly to her own life. Sitting now at her kitchen table, years later, she finally understood exactly what her mother had meant. She had been disappearing. Slowly, gradually, one small accommodation at a time, she had been making herself smaller to fit into a life Daniel was building for himself. A life that increasingly had less room for the woman she actually was, and more room only for a quiet, agreeable presence beside him, useful for managing the household, occasionally amusing for the stories she provided at dinner parties, but no longer valued as a genuine equal whose feelings and dreams mattered as much as his own. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked steadily toward 2 in the morning, and still Amara sat there, working through everything with the same patient thoroughness she brought to every difficult task in her life. She thought about staying, about trying once more to reach the man Daniel used to be, about the years of history between them that felt too significant to simply abandon. She thought about the vows she had made, about the promise to face life together through whatever came, and she wondered whether leaving now would mean she had failed to keep that promise. But then she thought again of her mother's words, and she understood, with a clarity sharper than any she had felt in months, That the promise she had made was to build a life with a partner, not to slowly disappear beside someone who no longer valued the very things that made her who she was. Daniel had broken something essential in their partnership long before tonight's conversation, breaking it slowly and repeatedly with every joke, every dismissive comment, every moment he chose the approval of strangers over the feelings of the woman who had believed in him since before anyone else did. She was not leaving because she had stopped loving him entirely. That would have been simpler in some ways, a clean break born from a clean absence of feeling. What she felt instead was more complicated, a lingering tenderness for the man he used to be, tangled together with a clear-eyed understanding that the man he had become no longer deserved the quiet, endless patience she had been offering him. Around 3 in the morning, Amara rose from the kitchen table. Her decision, though not yet fully formed into specific plans, settled firmly enough in her heart that she felt, for the first time in weeks, something close to peace. She walked quietly through the house, pausing in the living room where the old armchair sat in the dim moonlight coming through the window, running her fingers briefly along its worn arm, remembering the early years it represented before allowing herself to release the memory gently, without bitterness, simply as something that had once been true and was now becoming part of a chapter she was preparing to close. She thought of the blue sari still folded in its box, her mother's gift, and made a mental note to take it with her, along with a few other things that genuinely mattered, rather than everything the house contained. This would not be a dramatic departure filled with anger and broken plates. It would be quiet, deliberate, the kind of leaving that required more courage than any shouting match ever could, precisely because it demanded clarity rather than heat, resolve rather than rage. She returned to the bedroom sometime near 4 in the morning, lying down beside Daniel one final time, not to sleep, but simply to be still for a while, to let the last hours of this chapter of her life pass quietly before the sun rose on whatever came next. She did not feel anger looking at him now, sleeping peacefully beside her, unaware of the decision taking shape in the darkness. She felt, instead, something closer to grief, gentle and quiet, mourning the loss of who they might have remained to each other had things gone differently. Outside, somewhere beyond the window, the first faint hints of dawn had not yet appeared, the sky still deep and dark, the world still asleep. Amara lay there in the stillness, listening to Daniel's steady breathing beside her one last time, and felt, beneath the sadness, a quiet and unmistakable strength beginning to settle into her chest, steady as a heartbeat, patient as the coming dawn, waiting only for the right moment to carry her forward into whatever life awaited her beyond the walls of this house. The first faint gray light of morning had not yet touched the sky when Amara rose from the bed for the final time. She moved carefully, silently, each motion deliberate, practiced in her mind so many times over the past few hours that her body seemed to know exactly what to do before her thoughts had fully caught up. She dressed quietly in the dim light coming from the hallway, choosing simple, comfortable clothes rather than anything that might catch on furniture or slow her down. She glanced once at Daniel, still sleeping soundly, his face relaxed and untroubled in a way that struck her as almost unbearably peaceful given everything that had passed between them only hours earlier. She did not wake him. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said, and she understood with quiet certainty that any further conversation now would only invite the same defensive dismissals she had already heard too many times. She moved to the closet and retrieved a single suitcase, one she had not used since a visit to her mother's home years earlier, and began packing with a calm efficiency that surprised even herself. She did not take everything. She took only what mattered, a few changes of clothes, practical rather than sentimental, important documents she kept in a folder in the bottom drawer. A small amount of savings she had quietly set aside over the years from her tutoring work. Money Daniel had never asked about, and she had never mentioned, not out of secrecy exactly, but because it had always felt good to have something entirely her own. She opened the box containing her mother's blue sari and lifted it carefully, pressing it briefly against her chest before folding it gently into the suitcase. She added a small framed photograph from her wedding day, not because she wished to hold on to the marriage itself, but because the photograph also contained her mother, standing beside her in her best clothes, beaming with a pride Amara did not want to lose access to, whatever else changed in her life from this point forward. She left behind the green dress, the new clothes Daniel had encouraged her to buy over recent months, the jewelry he had gifted her during more hopeful times. These things belonged, she felt, to a version of their marriage that no longer existed, and carrying them forward into whatever came next felt like carrying forward a weight she no longer wished to bear. In the kitchen, she paused at the small writing desk near the window where she often sat to plan lessons for Ruth and the other children. She took a sheet of paper and a pen, and after a moment of stillness, began to write, her handwriting steady despite the emotion rising quietly beneath her calm exterior. She did not write pages of explanation or accusation. She wrote simply and honestly, the way she had always written to Daniel, though this letter, unlike the others, would not be tucked under a pillow or slipped into a coat pocket in hopeful anticipation of a warm response. This letter would be left on the kitchen table, plain and unhidden, meant to be found in the ordinary light of morning rather than discovered secretly and treasured. She wrote that she had loved him honestly and completely for 8 years, and that she did not regret a single one of those years, even now. She wrote that she had watched him grow into someone increasingly unable to see her clearly, someone who had begun mistaking cruelty for humor and dismissal for confidence. She wrote that she was leaving not out of anger, though anger had certainly visited her over recent weeks, but out of respect for herself, a respect she had nearly forgotten how to hold on to during the months she had spent making herself smaller in hopes of keeping their peace. She wrote that she hoped, sincerely, that he would find happiness, whether or not that happiness eventually included her. And she wrote, finally, that she was not disappearing from his life out of weakness, but walking away from it with more strength than she had felt in longer than she could remember. She folded the letter once, placed it in the center of the kitchen table where he would be certain to find it, and stood for a long moment looking around the kitchen, this room where she had prepared thousands of meals, celebrated small victories, comforted him during difficult days, and quietly absorbed, more recently, humiliations she should never have had to carry. Outside, somewhere in the distance, a rooster's first faint call broke the silence of the early morning, a sound so familiar from her childhood in her mother's village that it steadied rather than startled her. She understood, hearing it, that the day was beginning, that soon the household would stir, that Daniel would wake and reach across the bed for her out of habit before realizing she was gone. She lifted her suitcase, checked once more that she had left her set of house keys on the small table by the door, and stepped outside into the cool, quiet air of early morning, closing the door softly behind her, careful not to let it click too loudly against the frame. The street outside was empty, the sky above beginning its slow shift from deep navy toward the soft gray that precedes true dawn. Amara stood on the front step for a moment, breathing in the cool morning air, feeling something loosen in her chest that had been tight for weeks, perhaps longer. She thought briefly of turning back, one last flicker of doubt rising and falling like a wave, but she steadied herself against it, remembering her mother's words, remembering Clara's quiet advice near the garden lights, remembering Nora's gentle observation about disappearing. She began walking, her suitcase wheels quiet against the pavement, moving through streets she knew well, past houses still dark and sleeping, past the small corner shop just beginning to raise its shutters for the day. She had arranged, the previous afternoon during a brief private phone call to Nora, to stay with her sister for as long as she needed, and Nora had not asked a single question, had simply said, "Come whenever you're ready, I'll leave the door unlocked." The rooster called again somewhere behind her as she walked, and Amara found herself smiling faintly at the sound, an unexpected lightness settling over her despite the sadness still present beneath it. She had walked out before the household woke, before the rooster's full morning chorus began in earnest, choosing this quiet, undramatic hour precisely because she did not want confrontation, did not want tears or arguments or the exhausting negotiation that a dramatic scene might invite. She wanted simply to leave with dignity, the same dignity Daniel had so often overlooked in recent months, and to carry that dignity forward into whatever came next. By the time she reached Nora's small apartment on the other side of town, the sky had lightened considerably, the sun beginning its slow climb above the rooftops, painting the morning in soft gold light. Nora opened the door before Amara even had a chance to knock, as though she had been watching for her arrival, and without a word pulled her sister into a tight embrace. "You did it," Nora said quietly against her shoulder. "I know how hard that must have been." Amara nodded against her sister's shoulder, feeling tears rise again, though these felt different from the tears she had shed alone at Daniel's kitchen table hours earlier. These tears carried relief within them, and something that felt unmistakably like the very beginning of hope. "I don't know what happens now," Amara admitted, pulling back slightly to look at her sister's face. Nora smiled gently, taking the suitcase from her hand and guiding her inside. "Now," she said, "you get to figure out who you are again without anyone laughing at the parts of you that were always the best of you to begin with." Amara stepped inside her sister's small, warm apartment, the smell of fresh tea already drifting from the kitchen, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, that she was standing somewhere she genuinely belonged. Behind her, back across town, the sun continued its steady climb, and somewhere in that house she had walked away from, a man would soon wake to an empty bed, a folded letter on the kitchen table, and a silence he had never expected to face. Daniel woke that morning the way he woke most mornings, stretching lazily before reaching across the bed out of habit, expecting to find Amara already awake beside him or downstairs preparing breakfast. Instead, his hand met only cool, empty sheets, and for a moment he simply assumed she had risen early to begin her usual morning routine. He showered, dressed for work, and made his way downstairs, still thinking about the deal Victor had mentioned the previous evening, his mind occupied with numbers and possibilities rather than any real concern about his wife's whereabouts. It was only when he reached the kitchen, expecting the familiar smell of tea and breakfast, and found instead a silent, empty room, that a small flicker of confusion passed through him. Then he saw the folded letter sitting in the center of the table, and something in his chest tightened unexpectedly before he had even read a single word. He read it once quickly, then again more slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to something closer to genuine alarm as the meaning of her words settled fully into his understanding. He called her phone immediately, but it rang through to silence, no answer, no explanation beyond the letter already sitting in his hands. He told himself, standing there in the empty kitchen, that this was simply an overreaction, that Amara would return by evening once she had calmed down, that she had likely gone to Nora's for a day or two to cool off before coming back home as she always eventually did after their occasional disagreements. He went to work that day distracted, replaying the letter's words in his mind between meetings, telling himself repeatedly that this was temporary, that she would come around. She did not come around that day, or the day after, or the week that followed. By the end of the first week, Daniel's confidence had begun to crack in ways he had not anticipated. He called Nora directly, only to be told firmly but politely that Amara did not wish to speak with him yet, and that Nora would not be sharing any further details about her sister's whereabouts or state of mind. He reached out to mutual friends, hoping someone might offer sympathy or take his side, only to find, uncomfortably, that several people who had laughed along with his jokes at parties now seemed to view him with a new and unflattering clarity. Clara, in particular, made her feelings known without hesitation when Daniel attempted to bring up the situation during a chance encounter at a business event. "You should have listened to her the first time she told you it hurt," Clara said simply, before walking away to rejoin another conversation, leaving Daniel standing alone with the uncomfortable weight of her words. Even Victor, who had always seemed to encourage Daniel's more careless jokes at Amara's expense, grew noticeably quieter on the subject whenever it arose, offering only vague, uncomfortable sympathy rather than the reassurance Daniel had hoped to find among his new circle of friends. Alone in the house at night, Daniel began, slowly and reluctantly at first, to replay the past several months with a clarity he had not previously allowed himself. He remembered the letters he had mocked, remembering now, with a discomfort he could not fully explain away, how carefully each one had been written, how much thought Amara had clearly put into choosing her words. He remembered the blue sari, remembering suddenly, and with a sharp pang of regret, that it had belonged to her late mother, a detail he had brushed past too quickly on the evening he asked her to change into something else instead. He remembered, too, the early years of their marriage, memories he had not visited in a long time, buried beneath the busier, more ambitious version of himself that recent success had encouraged. He remembered the first letter Amara had ever written him, the one he had carried in his wallet for years, and with a sudden, uncomfortable urgency, he searched through his desk drawers until he found it, still folded carefully where he had placed it long ago, though he had not looked at it in longer than he cared to admit. He read it slowly, sitting alone at the same kitchen table where Amara's final letter had waited for him weeks earlier, and felt, for the first time since she left, the full weight of what he had lost settle over him. The young man who had once been so moved by these simple, honest words that he closed an important business deal on the strength of renewed courage seemed, reading the letter now, almost like a stranger, someone Daniel barely recognized in himself anymore. He thought about calling her again, about showing up at Nora's apartment uninvited, about pleading his case in person the way he might argue a difficult point in a business negotiation. But something in him understood, with a clarity that felt uncomfortable precisely because it was true, that Amara had not left because of a single argument that could be resolved with the right words delivered persuasively enough. She had left because of a pattern he had built slowly, one careless comment at a time. Over months he had barely paused to notice passing. Weeks turned into a month, then two. Daniel's business continued to grow, outwardly successful, deals closing, new opportunities arising, the polished life he had worked so hard to build for himself expanding exactly as he had once hoped it would. But the house felt increasingly hollow around him, each room echoing with an absence he had never anticipated feeling so sharply. The mismatched furniture Amara had once filled with careful memory now simply sat quiet and unused, gathering dust in rooms Daniel rarely lingered in anymore. He found himself, on more than one evening, sitting in the old armchair Amara had loved, running his hand along its worn arm exactly the way she used to, remembering suddenly and vividly the year he had fixed its broken leg himself with borrowed tools, determined to save money during a difficult stretch early in their marriage rather than replace it entirely. He remembered how proud she had been of him that evening, praising his effort as though he had accomplished something far greater than a simple repair, and how genuinely happy that praise had made him feel, back before praise from wealthier, more polished friends had begun to matter more to him than praise from his own wife. It was during one of these quiet evenings, sitting alone in that same armchair, that Daniel finally allowed himself to understand something he had been resisting for months. His success, however outwardly impressive it had become, had cost him something he had not properly valued until it was gone. He had spent so much energy chasing the approval of people like Victor and Paula, people who measured worth by polish and performance, that he had lost sight of the one person whose steady, unglamorous belief in him had actually carried him through the years when he had nothing else to offer the world. He began writing her a letter of his own, though he tore up several attempts before finally settling on words that felt honest rather than merely persuasive. He did not send it immediately. He understood, with a maturity that had come slowly and painfully over the preceding weeks, that Amara deserved more than a hastily written apology aimed at winning her back before she was ready. She deserved time, genuine reflection on his part, and proof, eventually, rather than mere promises, that he had truly understood what he had done. Whether that proof would ever be enough, whether Amara would ever be willing to hear it, Daniel did not know. But for the first time since she had walked out before the Rooster's first full call that quiet morning, he began to understand, fully and without excuse, exactly what he had lost, and exactly how much of the responsibility for that loss belonged entirely to choices he alone had made. Amara's first weeks at Nora's apartment passed in a strange mixture of grief and quiet relief, two feelings she had not expected to experience so closely intertwined. There were mornings she woke with a familiar ache in her chest, missing the rhythm of a life she had shared with Daniel for 8 years. And there were mornings she woke feeling lighter than she had in longer than she could remember, grateful simply for the ability to move through her day without bracing herself for the next small wound. Nora never pushed her to talk before she was ready, offering instead a steady, patient presence that reminded Amara of their mother, quietly making tea in the mornings, leaving space for silence when silence was needed, and offering gentle conversation when Amara finally found herself ready to speak. It was during one of these evening conversations, several weeks after she had left, that Amara finally allowed herself to speak honestly about everything that had happened. Not just the party, not just the letters, but the slow, gradual process of losing herself inside a marriage that had once felt like the safest place in the world. "I kept telling myself it was temporary," Amara admitted, curled into the corner of Nora's small sofa with a cup of tea warming her hands. "That he was just stressed, just adjusting to success, that the man I fell in love with was still there underneath it all." "Maybe he was," Nora said gently. "But that doesn't mean you were required to keep waiting for him to find his way back to being that man. You gave him 8 years of patience, Amara. At some point, patience without change just becomes a slow erosion of yourself." Amara nodded slowly, letting the truth of her sister's words settle over her without resistance this time. She thought of her mother's words about disappearing, about love not being the same thing as making yourself smaller for someone else's comfort, and she understood, more fully now than she had even on the morning she left, how deeply those words applied to everything she had experienced. Over the following months, Amara began, slowly and deliberately, to rebuild a life defined by her own choices rather than someone else's expectations. She found a small apartment of her own, modest but entirely hers, furnished gradually with pieces she chose because she genuinely loved them, not because they needed to impress anyone who might visit. She expanded her tutoring work, eventually renting a small room above a neighborhood shop where she could teach several children at once, watching with quiet pride as her small project, the very thing Daniel had once dismissed so casually, grew into something that genuinely mattered to the families in her community. Ruth, the young girl who had once struggled to read simple sentences, came to Amara's new teaching space one afternoon carrying a thick storybook nearly as large as her own arms, eager to show her teacher how far she had come. Amara sat with her for over an hour that day, listening to Ruth read aloud with growing confidence, feeling something warm and steady settle in her chest, a reminder of exactly why this work had always mattered to her, regardless of whether anyone at a dinner party understood its value. She heard from Daniel occasionally during these months, first through brief, hesitant phone calls she did not always answer, and later through a letter he sent, carefully written, which Nora handed to her one evening without comment, simply placing it on the table and leaving the room to give her privacy. Amara read the letter alone in her new apartment, sitting by the window where evening light fell softly across the page. Daniel's words, unlike the careless jokes she remembered from parties and dinners, felt genuinely considered, an honest attempt to name exactly what he had done, and why it had cost him something he had not properly understood the value of until it was gone. He did not ask her to return immediately. He simply asked for the chance, someday, to prove through consistent action rather than empty promises that he had truly changed. Amara sat with the letter for a long while after reading it, feeling a complicated mixture of emotions move through her, old tenderness mingling with hard-won clarity, sadness for what they had lost mingling with pride in the strength she had found within herself since walking away. She did not respond immediately. She understood, with the same patient wisdom that had guided her decision to leave in the first place, that whatever she decided about Daniel's future place in her life deserved careful thought rather than a hasty reaction born from either lingering affection or lingering hurt. What she knew clearly, sitting there in her own apartment, surrounded by furniture she had chosen herself, teaching work that filled her with genuine purpose, and a growing sense of her own worth that no longer depended on anyone else's approval, was that she was no longer the woman who had smiled through humiliation to keep a fragile peace. Whatever happened next, whether she eventually forgave Daniel, remained permanently separated from him, or found her way toward some entirely different future she could not yet imagine, she would face it as herself, fully present, fully valued, refusing ever again to make herself smaller for anyone's comfort. Months later, on a quiet evening much like the many that had passed since she left, Amara stood at her window watching the sun set over the rooftops of her new neighborhood, painting the sky in the same warm gold light that had greeted her on the morning she arrived at Nora's door with a single suitcase, and a heart both broken and beginning, in equal measure, to heal. She thought of the rooster's call that had followed her down the quiet street that morning, a sound she had once associated only with her childhood in her mother's village, now forever linked in her memory with the moment she had chosen herself over comfortable silence, chosen dignity over quiet endurance, chosen a future she could not yet fully see over a present that had slowly been erasing the very best parts of who she was. She did not know, standing there in the fading evening light, exactly what her future held. She did not know whether Daniel's change was genuine or temporary, whether their story had truly ended or was simply pausing before some new chapter neither of them could yet predict. But she knew, with a certainty that had grown steadily stronger with every week since that quiet morning departure, that whatever came next, she would meet it as a woman fully present in her own life, unwilling ever again to let anyone's laughter, however careless or unkind, convince her that her love, her tenderness, or her worth was ever something small enough to be mocked. The sun sank lower behind the rooftops, and somewhere in the distance, faint and familiar, a rooster called out into the gathering evening, marking not an ending this time, but simply another ordinary day drawing gently to its close, one of many now unfolding in a life Amara had claimed fully and courageously as entirely her own. A year passed, and the small teaching room above the neighborhood shop had grown into something Amara could hardly have imagined during her quietest, most uncertain nights at Nora's apartment. What had begun with a handful of children gathered around a borrowed table now filled 2 rooms each afternoon, with parents waiting outside to hear their children read aloud sentences they had once struggled to sound out. Ruth, older now and full of the kind of confidence that comes from being consistently believed in, had begun helping Amara teach the younger children, proudly calling herself a junior teacher whenever anyone asked. Amara had changed in ways, both visible and invisible, over that year. She stood taller now, not out of any deliberate effort, but simply because she no longer carried the quiet weight of shrinking herself to fit someone else's comfort. She laughed more easily, spoke more freely, and found herself, on more than one occasion, surprised by how natural it felt to take up space in a room without immediately checking whether her presence might embarrass anyone standing beside her. She had not seen Daniel in person since the morning she left, though their occasional letters had continued, growing gradually more honest and less desperate on his part as the months passed. He had, according to what Nora occasionally mentioned hearing through mutual acquaintances, distanced himself from Victor and much of the social circle that had encouraged his most careless behavior, choosing instead to spend more time reflecting quietly on the kind of man he wanted to become rather than the kind of man impressive dinner parties had once convinced him to be. Amara did not know whether she would ever fully forgive him, or whether forgiveness, in the end, was even the right word for whatever peace she might eventually find regarding their shared history. What she knew clearly was that she no longer needed his apology to feel whole. Her worth, she had come to understand fully over the past year, had never actually depended on whether Daniel recognized it. It had simply been waiting patiently for her to reclaim it herself. One afternoon, near the end of that first full year on her own, Amara received a final letter from Daniel, different in tone from all the ones before it. He wrote that he understood now, fully and without excuse, that some things once broken cannot simply be repaired by good intentions alone, no matter how sincere those intentions eventually become. He wrote that he no longer expected her to return to him, and that he had finally stopped hoping for a reconciliation that might cost her the strength and peace she had clearly built for herself. He wished her happiness, genuinely and without condition, and thanked her plainly for the years of belief she had given him before he had learned, too late, how rare and valuable that belief truly was. Amara read the letter twice, sitting once again by her window in the soft evening light, and felt, this time, a quiet sense of closure settle over her rather than the complicated mixture of emotions his earlier letters had stirred. She folded it carefully and placed it in a small box where she kept a few meaningful items from her past, not to hold onto the pain of what had happened, but simply to honor the fact that it had been part of her story, a chapter that had ultimately taught her the true weight of her own worth. That evening, she walked to the small balcony of her apartment and looked out over the city, watching the lights begin to flicker on across rooftops as evening settled fully into night. She thought of the young woman who had once waited outside a college gate for a boy holding badly arranged flowers, and she thought of the woman standing here now, independent, respected, surrounded by a community of children and families who valued her not for how she performed at a dinner party, but for the genuine care and dedication she brought to their lives every single day. She understood, standing there in the cool evening air, that her story had never truly been about Daniel at all, not in its deepest sense. It had been about the slow, difficult, ultimately triumphant journey of remembering her own value after years of allowing someone else's careless words to convince her that value was negotiable. It had been about learning that walking away from something familiar, even something once loved deeply, could be the bravest and most necessary act of self-respect a person could offer themselves. Somewhere across town, in the house that still held 8 years of shared memory, Daniel continued building a different kind of life, one shaped now by genuine reflection rather than careless ambition, carrying forward the lessons his greatest loss had finally taught him. Whether their paths would ever cross again in any meaningful way, neither of them could say for certain. But both had been changed permanently by the events of that quiet morning, when a rooster's first call had marked not simply an ending, but the beginning of a woman finally choosing herself, fully and without apology, over a comfortable silence that had cost her far too much for far too long. Amara stood on her balcony until the last light faded fully from the sky, feeling steady, feeling whole, feeling, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely and completely at home within her own life. And as the stars began to appear one by one above the quiet city, she smiled softly to herself, grateful not for the pain that had brought her here, but for the strength she had discovered within herself to finally, courageously, walk toward something better.